Chapter 11. In the summer, the year after they had lost Audun, Olav and Ingunn were at a working meeting on a farm in the neighbourhood. They had Eirik with them. The boy was now 7 winters old, and he was apt to be unmanageable when amusing himself. When work was over in the evening, the people sat in a meadow near the house which they had been roofing. Some of the younger ones then began to dance. Eirik and some other little boys ran about and made a noise. The ale had gone to their heads. They ran straight at the chain of dancers and tried to break it, shouting and laughing as they did so. They mixed among the older folk, jostling one after another, and interrupted the men's talk. Olav had spoken to Eirik time after time, rather sharply at last, but it only kept the boy quiet for a little while. Ingunn had not noticed it. She was sitting a little way off by the wall in company with other women. All at once Olav appeared before her, dragging Eirik with him. He lifted him by the back of his shirt, so that the boy hung from Olav's hand as one takes a puppy by the nape of the neck. Olav was red in the face, somewhat drunken. His ale was apt to tell on him more than usual when these fits of sleeplessness had been very frequent. "You must see and keep your boy in order, Ingunn," he said angrily, giving Eirik a shake. "He will not obey me unless I thrash him. Take him. He belongs to you." And he flung the boy so that Eirik pitched into his mother's arms. With that he went away. In the course of the evening, when folk sat drinking in the shed after supper, some of them began to tell stories, and Sira Halbjorn told the tale of Jökull. A rich merchant fared forth, and was away from home 3 winters. So every man may judge whether he was more surprised or joyful when he came home and found his wife abed, and with her a little boy of 1 month old. But the traveller's wife was a crafty and quick-witted woman. She said, "A great miracle has befallen me. Sorely have I longed for you, my husband, while you wandered so far abroad. But one day last winter I stood here at the door of the house, and the icicles hung from the eaves. I broke one off and sucked, yearning for you the while with keen and ardent desire. And then I conceived this child. Judge for yourself whether you and none other are not his father. Jökull, I have called him." The traveller had to rest content with that. He spoke her fair, this loving wife of his, and seemed to have great joy of the son, Jökull. He would always have the boy near him when he was at home. And when Jökull was 12 years old, his father took him out on one of his voyages. But one day, when they were in the midst of the sea, and Jökull stood at the ship's side, the merchant came behind him, while no man saw. He dropped the boy overboard. On returning to his wife, he told his tale with sorrowful mien and mourning voice. "Great misfortune has befallen us, and a heavy loss have we suffered, my sweet one. Jökull is no more. I lay becalmed in the midst of the sea. The day was hot, and the sun poured straight down. Our Jökull stood upon the deck, and he was bareheaded. I begged him hard to cover his head, but he would not. So he thawed in the heat of the sun, and there was nothing left of Jökull, our son, but a wet spot on the deck planks." With that, the wife had to rest content. Folk laughed greatly at this tale. No one took note that Olav Audunsson kept his eyes on the floor, while blushes overspread his face. If his life had depended on it, he did not believe he would have dared to turn his eyes to the dais, where his wife sat among the other ladies. Then there was a disturbance up there. Olav leapt over the table and forced his way through the crowding women. He lifted up his wife, who had slipped from the bench in a swoon, and carried her out into the fresh air. The best thing Eirik knew was to be allowed to go out with his father, in a boat when Olav rowed out alone to fish with a hand line, as he did now and then, mainly for pastime, or across the fields. Afterwards he always came back to his mother and told her about it, with beaming eyes, so eagerly that he stumbled over the words, all that had happened to them, and all that he had learnt from his father. Now he could both row and fish, make knots, and splice ropes after the fashion of seafaring men. Soon he would be able to go out and fish in earnest with his father and the men. He had become such a good hand at shooting and casting. His father said he had never seen his match. Ingunn listened to the boy's chatter, perplexed and distressed. Her poor, simple-minded little boy loved Olav more than anyone else on earth. It was as though the man's unfriendliness did not bite upon Eirik. He was given curt answers to all his questions, and at last he was told to hold his tongue. Olav coldly chid him when the boy was wild and wanton, and harshly bade Eirik speak the truth when his mother guessed that only the child's memory was at fault. But she dared not say that to her husband, dared not take Eirik's part and remind Olav that he was so young, or tell the man Eirik called father how dearly the child loved him. She had to bow the neck and keep silence. Only when she was alone with her son did she dare to show her love for him. Ingunn did not know that what Eirik said was true, and that it was for this that Olav's bad humour neither frightened the boy for long at a time, nor lessened his love for his father. They agreed much better when they were alone together. Eirik was then more obedient and not so restless, and even if he was too fond of asking odd questions, there was often some sense in them. He swallowed every word from his father's lips with eyes and ears, and this made him forget to come out with his fables and rigmaroles. Without being himself aware of it, Olav was warmed by the affection the child showed him. He forgot his dislike of other days, and let himself be warmed, just as he had felt warmed whenever anyone showed him the friendship which he found it so hard to seek for himself. So he met Eirik halfway with calm goodwill. He instructed the boy in the use of weapons and implements, which were still more like playthings, smiled a little at Eirik's eager questions, and chatted with him as a good father talks to his little son. They fished for wrasse under the cliff north of the Bull, and Olav showed the boy the cleft in the rock where an old she-otter had her lair. Every year Olav took the cubs, 1 year 2 litters, and the dog-otter. As soon as the dog was gone, she got a new mate, said Olav, and he mimicked for the boy the otter's cry. Yes, Eirik should come with him after the otter one night, when he was a little older. Ah, when that would be, his father could not say. One day, when they were up in his father's game hide to see to some traps, Olav chanced to speak of his own childhood at Fretestein, while he and Eirik's mother were young. "Your grandfather," said Olav, telling some story of Steinfinn at which he himself smiled, and Eirik roared with laughter. "One day I had coaxed Halvard, your uncle, with me. He was very small at that time, you must know. But all the same, I had taken the boy with me up to the tarn, where we had a dugout we used to row in." Till Eirik mentioned Tora of Berg. He remembered her. Olav broke off his story, answered absently when the boy went on asking questions, and at last bade him to hold his tongue. It was as though the sky had suddenly clouded over. But whenever Olav was with his own housecarls, either on the quay or up at the manor, and Eirik ran among them, he was at once more impatient with the boy. It was the way with Eirik that, the more people he saw about him, the more noisy and foolish and disobedient he became. The men were amused at the boy, but they noticed that the master disliked their laughing at the things he said, and they thought Olaf was very short-tempered and strict with his only son. But it was when the mother was there that Olaf felt most provoked to an intolerable ill will toward the boy. Many a time he itched to give Eirik a thrashing, to break him roughly of all his bad habits. One thing was that Ingunn provoked him to a dull exasperation when she fussed with the child. He was to be quiet and behave in a seemly way, she said severely. Olaf knew only too well that the moment his back was turned on the two, she would be on her knees trying to please Eirik. He saw how deeply she distrusted his feeling for the boy. She spied on him secretly when he was occupied with Eirik. He knew in himself that he had never done the child any harm. He might surely be trusted to punish the boy when he needed it. It was Ingunn who egged him on to anger, but it was his lifelong habit, when she was concerned, to hold himself in, and of late years it had come to this, that she was a poor, sick creature, and he had to be doubly careful not to make things worse for her. So when Ingunn tried Olaf's patience too far, it was usually Eirik who suffered. The boy had come between man and wife, and he was the first who had sundered their hearts in earnest. In their youth Olaf had had to leave his playmate and fly the country, and in a way he had felt that Ingunn had gone astray simply because he had been forced to abandon her. Far too great a burden of evil fortune had been thrown upon her when she had to have recourse to her angry kinsfolk, who refused to count her as anything but a disobedient and dishonoured woman. She was young, weak-shouldered and pampered, but her nature was not such that she could have been unfaithful to a husband with whom she shared bed and board. He knew that. He had had a feeling that Tiet was but an unhappy accident, and in making an end of this confiding fool, he had acted more from a belief that it would be so hopelessly difficult to remedy the disaster, so long as he was alive and could blurt out the truth, than because he felt himself wronged by Tiet. But even when the slaying had been accomplished, this had not done much to allay his pain of mind. His thirst to avenge the destruction of his happiness, this the poor corpse in the satyr had not been able greatly to assuage. Now Olaf saw that Ingunn loved another, and he guessed how often she had wished him out of the way, so that she might freely shed her affection upon Eirik, as one smuggles food to an outlawed friend behind the back of the master of the house. And together with this bitterness and unrest, something like a ghost of his youthful desire awoke in Olaf's heart and senses. He longed to possess Ingunn, as he had possessed her in former days, when they were young and healthy and could find happiness in each other's arms in spite of all their cares. Olaf had never quite forgotten that time. The memory of her sweet beauty had warmed his pity to a painful tenderness. This poor faded wreck, to whom he was bound, was the wreck of the lovely, useless Ingunn he had once loved, and his will to protect her became stubborn and intense, as had once been his will to defend his right to his wife. Now there blazed up in him a desire to feel that she too remembered the madness of their youth. Year in, year out, a latent repugnance had smouldered within him, when she clung to him with her morbid and insensate demand for caresses which, he knew, ought to be withheld from his sick wife. Now, when she avoided him, hiding herself away with what was her own, what she thought he could have no share in, it was Olaf who felt he would rather have had crushed her to pieces in his arms, in the effort to make her answer such questions as these. "Have you forgotten that I was once your dearest friend in all the world? Why are you afraid of me? Have I ever willingly brought sorrow upon you in all these years? It cannot be my fault that we have had so little happiness in our married life." And then his fear awoke, when he touched upon the sick spot in his mind. The dull ache became a pain that shot through his whole being, whether it was so that he might all the time have averted her misfortunes, if he had had the courage to hand himself over to men's justice and God's compassion. Olaf noticed that his unwonted impetuosity now frightened Ingunn and made her shrink. So he withdrew into himself, while his secret wound throbbed and stung. Why is she afraid of me? Does she know? There were times when he almost believed it, believed that all knew it, for he had not a friend here in his native country. It could not be helped, but that was not all. Olaf guessed that no one liked him. Coldness and distrust met him everywhere, and often he thought he could detect a hidden malicious satisfaction when things went ill with him. Yet in this part of the country he had always acted rightly, and had never done any man an injustice. He could not even bring himself to be angry at this. He received his sentence without wincing. It must be that folk saw the secret mark upon his brow. But when he thought of Ingunn, the fear quivered through him. Did she see it too? Was it for that she turned cold in his arms? And was it for that she seemed to be afraid when he came near her son? On the day of St. Olaf's Mass, Olaf always held an ale feast. He never prayed to his patron saint. The lawmaker king would certainly not aid him with his intercession, except on one condition. But nevertheless he thought himself bound to show holy Olaf due honour. The floor was strewed with green, and the hall was decorated with hangings, the old tapestry which otherwise only appeared at Yule. On St. Olaf's Eve, Olaf himself was busy hanging up the tapestry. He moved along the bench and fastened the long piece with wooden hooks, which he drove in between the topmost log of the wall and the roof. Eirik followed him on the floor, gazing at the worked pictures. There were knights and long ships with men on board. He knew that soon the best picture of all was coming, a house with pillars and shingled roof like a church, and a banquet going on inside with drinking horns and tankards on the table. Eirik had to peep into the roll of stuff which still lay on the bench. In so doing, he chanced to bring down a long piece of that which his father had just made to hang right. Olaf jumped down, pulled the boy from under the folds of tapestry, and flung him on the floor. "Out with you! You are always in my way, bastard, doing mischief." At that moment Ingunn appeared in the door of the anteroom, with the lap of her gown full of flowers. She let her burden fall straight on the floor. He saw that she had heard. Olaf did not get a word out. Shame, anger, and a confused feeling that soon he would not know which way to turn made a tumult within him. He stepped up on the bench and began to hang up the tapestry that had been torn down. Eirik had fled out of the door. Ingunn picked up her flowers and strewed them over the floor. Olaf dared not turn around and look at her. He did not feel equal to talking to her now. One morning, a few days later, Ingunn was sitting with Eirik on the top of the crag behind the houses of Hestviken. She had been down to Saltviken. A path led over the height. It would serve at a pinch for riding, but was little used. The common way between Hestviken and Saltviken was by boat. There was sparkling sunshine and a fresh breeze. From where Ingunn sat, she saw the fjord, dark blue, dotted with white foam. The breakers dashed up in spray, glittering white along the reddish rocks which planted their feet out into the water all along the coast. The morning sun still lay over Hudeheimsland. From the height where she sat, she could see a little of the cultivation on the hillside. It was for that she liked this spot. And up here it sounded fainter and farther off, that intolerable roar of the sea, which tormented her at home at the manor, till she thought it must come from within her own weary, bewildered head. But there was a kind of taste of salt, and that flickering of light from the sea in the uneasy air. She could never accustom herself to that. She grew tired of it. Eirik lay half in his mother's lap, playing with a bunch of big bluebells. One after another he tore off the flowers, turned them inside out, and blew into them. Ingunn laid her thin hand on his cheek and looked down into his sunburnt face. How handsome he was, this son of hers! His eyes the shade of bogwater in sunshine, his hair as fine as silk. It had grown much darker in the last year. It was brown now. Eirik scratched his head. Louse me now, mother mine. They bite so hard at this heat. Ingunn gave a little laugh. She took out her comb from the pouch at her belt and began to clean the boy's head with slow, caressing strokes. It made Eirik sleepy, and the scent of the fir woods in the sun's heat, and the sourish fragrance of the hair moss on which she was lying, the clanging of bells from the cattle moving on the slope farther up the valley, lulled Ingunn to sleep. She started at the little sound of a dog that came swimming through the high bilberry bushes. It sniffed at the two, jumped without a sound over their knees, and set off again down the path. Her heart still trembled from being waked so suddenly. Now she heard horses' hoofs on the rock far below. Her head fell back against the stem of the fir tree by which she sat. Oh, that he should be back already! She had felt so sure he would not come home before evening at the earliest, perhaps not before the morrow. They came over her again, the same thronging fears and despair. This thing that she had gone in dread of the last month. She could not face it, she felt that. It would be her death this time, and she could almost have wished it, had it not been for Eirik's sake. Then he would be left alone with Olav. And in the midst of her great dread, this little anxiety started up. Why had Olav come home so soon? Had he not been able to accomplish his errand in the neighbouring parish? Or had he fallen out with those folk? And maybe he came home in yet worse humour than when he set out. Instinctively she had thrown her arm about her child, as though to protect and hide him. Eirik struggled and freed himself. "Let me go now. Father is coming." He got on his feet, and his mother saw that he turned red as he went along the path, seeming a little uncertain and hesitating. Ingunn followed. She saw the white horse among the trees. Olav was walking by its side. When Ingunn came up, he was showing Eirik something that lay at his foot, a great lynx. "I found her over on the mountain here to the south. She was out in broad daylight. She has young in her lair. Her teats are full of milk." He turned over the dead lynx with his spear, shooing off the dog, which lay on its front paws barking, and holding the uneasy horse. Eirik cried aloud with joy, squatting down over his father's quarry. Olav smiled at the boy. "We could not find the lair, though it cannot have been far away. But there was a scree with fallen trees on it. She must have had her track among the trees." "Will they starve to death now, the young ones?" asked Ingunn. Eirik fumbled in the light fur under the belly of the lynx, found the swollen teats and squeezed them. The boy's hands were all bloody. Olav was telling him how it was easy enough to get the lynx, when it strayed out in broad daylight. Starved to death? Yes. Or else they will eat each other. The strongest will come through. Unless they were born very early in the summer. That is like enough, since the mother was not with them. Ingunn looked at the dead beast of prey. A soft, warm place the young had had, as they huddled together, nosing for the sources of milk in the light fur under her soft belly. The heavy thigh that she had protected them with was tense with muscle and sinew. The claws were like steel. When she licked her young, the cruel white fangs showed up. The tufts of hair in the ears had been given to her to make her the more wary and sharp of hearing. The black streaks in her yellow eyes had been like keen slits. She had been well fitted to protect and defend and discipline her offspring. Her own child? He had such a poor wretch of a mother, unable to defend her own. And she herself had brought it to such a pass that he had no one to protect him, and most he needed protection against the man he called father. I cannot believe even Mary, God's mother, will pray for a mother who betrays her own son. Torah had said that, and she had already betrayed her child when she suffered him to be begotten. She saw that now. Olav and Eirik were pulling up bunches of moss and wiping away the blood which had got onto the saddle and run down the side of the white horse. Olav helped the boy into the saddle and placed the reins in his hand. He is so quiet, Applebit. Eirik will be able to ride him home, though it is a little steep below here. He walked a few steps down, cheering the boy and the horse with kind words. Then he returned to the lynx and bound its limbs together with thongs. Now and again he looked up, watching the boy on the big white horse, till they were lost among the trees. No, we came to no agreement. It was vain to stay there disputing with those Carrisons, he said. I think that Eirik ought to have Applebit. He's 7 winters old now, isn't he? It will soon be time he had his own horse, and it is unsafe to let the boy ride Cinder. He is too skittish. What are you crying for? He asked rather sharply as he rose to his feet. If you gave Eirik the fairest colt ever bred, with saddle of silver and bridle of gold, what would that serve, Olav, if you cannot alter your feelings, can never look at the boy without a grudge? That is not true, said Olav hotly. You are heavy too, you sow of Satan. He had got the lynx on his spear and hoisted it over his shoulder. Do use your wits, Ingunn, he went on, rather more gently. Can I have any joy of the son who is to take this manner after me, if he is always to hide behind your skirt, now that he is of an age to need a father's teaching and discipline? You must venture it now, to let me take Eirik in hand. Else there never will be a man of him. The breeze up here on the height fluttered his long grey cloak. The wide brim of his black cloth hat flapped. Olav had come to look much older in the last few years. He was no stouter than before, yet his figure seemed much more burly, broader and rounder behind the shoulders, and the pale eyes looked smaller and even sharper than of old, as his face was now browned by the weather. The whites were somewhat bloodshot, no doubt because the man had too little sleep. He felt her staring at him, till he was forced to turn his head. He met her complaining glance with a hard eye. I know what you are thinking about, Ingunn. I spoke a word in wrath. God knows I wish I had not said it. Ingunn crouched as though expecting a blow. Olav began again, forcing himself to be calm. But you must not act in that way, Ingunn, as to entice him away from me, as though you were afraid I should. Never have I chastised Eirik excessively. I do not remember that my father ever laid a hand upon you, Olav." "No, Steinfinn cared not to trouble himself so far on my account as to correct me. But I have never departed from my own word, not from my word to you, Ingunn, in any case. And now I have let all men know that Eirik is our son, yours and mine." He saw that she was ready to faint, but it seemed to him that this time he could not turn aside, saying some new thing to blot out the traces of what he had already said. He went on. "It is worse for us all if you steal away with your motherly love and dare not take Eirik on your lap when I am there to see. Deal with the boy in hole and corner fashion, as though you crept away by stealth to meet a layman." He took her hand, pressed it hard, and kept it. "Remember, my dear, by so doing you serve Eirik worst." On the eve of St. Matthew, early in the day, Eirik came rushing in to his parents, who were in the hall. He was screaming at the top of his voice. Kar and Ranvig, the two children Bjorn had left, who were still with Torhild, came after him, and Olav and Ingunn heard from them what had happened. The stoat that lived in the turf roof of the sheepcot had had another litter of young, and Eirik had tried to dig out the nest, though Olav had said they were to be left in peace this summer. Eirik had been bitten in the hand. Olav seized the boy, lifted him up, and carried him to his mother's arms. Hurriedly he took the child's hand and looked at it. The bite was in the little finger. "Are you able to hold him, or shall I fetch in Torhild?" "Be quiet. Say nothing to Eirik. He can be saved if we are quick enough about it." The stoat's bite is the most poisonous of all animals. The flesh of him who is bitten by an enraged stoat rots and falls from the bones till the man dies, or else he gets the falling sickness, for all stoats have falling sickness. Only if one be bitten in the tip of one finger, there may be a chance of saving life and health, if the finger be cut off and the wound burnt out. Quick as lightning, Olav made everything ready. Among the smaller implements kept in a crack of the wall, he found a suitable iron and put it in the fire, bidding Kar Bjornsson blow. Then he drew his dagger and set to sharpening it. But the serving maid, who had been called in to hold the boy, began to scream loudly. Eirik was scared already. Now he guessed what his father would do to him. With a howl of the utmost terror, he tore himself away from his mother and ran like a rat from wall to wall, howling worse and worse, with Olav after him. A ladder stood leading up to the loft above the closet. Eirik ran up it, and Olav followed him. In the darkness, among all the piled-up chattels, he got hold of the boy at last, and came down the ladder carrying him. Eirik kicked and sprawled and yelled inside the flap of his father's kirtle, which Olav had had to wrap about his head so as not to be bitten by the maddened child. Ingunn did not look as though he could expect help from her. Torhild had come in. Olav gave Eirik to her, and the two other serving women also took a hand. Eirik fought and screamed in mortal fear as they struggled to wind a cloth about his head. Then the father pulled the cloth from the boy's eyes. "Your life is at stake, Eirik. Look at me, boy. You will die if you will not let me save you." Olav was in a raging tumult. This was the last of her children, and she loved the child as she had never loved him. If she were to lose Eirik, it would be the end of everything. He must and would save the boy. If it might cost him his own life, he must. At the same time he felt a cruel desire and longing to get home at last on this flesh that had come between him and her, to maim and burn it. And in spite of that, something arose from the innermost depths of his being and forbade him to harm the defenceless child. "Do not scream like that," he hissed in fury. "You wretched whelp, don't be so afraid. It is no worse than Look at this!" He set the point of his dagger to the lining of the sleeve at his left wrist, and slit and cut till his shirt and the sleeve of his kirtle hung in tatters right up to the shoulder. He quickly wound the rags about his arm so that they would not be in the way, took the red-hot iron by the tongs, and pressed it against his upper arm. Eirik had stopped howling from fear and surprise at what his father was doing. He lay limply in the woman's arms and stared. But now he set up a fresh shriek of terror. Olaf had had a vague idea of putting heart into the boy, but all he had done was to scare away the rest of his wits. The smell of the scorched flesh, the sight of the spasm that passed over Olaf's face as he withdrew the iron from the burn, made the boy clean mad. A straight stream of blood ran down the man's white arm as he let it drop. His dagger had entered the flesh as he started. Then, all at once, Ingunn was there. She was white in the face, but perfectly calm now, as she took the child on her lap, held his legs tight between her knees, threw the end of her coif across his face, and caught it under one arm. With her other hand she took him by the wrist and held the little fist against the table. The serving maids helped to hold the boy, smothering his hideous screams of pain with more cloths, while Olaf took off the damaged finger at the inner joint, burnt out the wound, and bound it up. He did it so rapidly and so neatly, as he had never guessed himself able to accomplish leechcraft. While the women attended to the wailing child, got him to bed and poured strengthening drinks into him, Olaf sat on the bench. Only now did he feel the pain of his burn, and he was ashamed and furious with himself for being capable of such senseless conduct, maltreating himself to no purpose like a madman. Torhild came up to him with white of egg in a cup and a box of fuzzball fungus. She was going to tend his arm, but Ingunn took the things from the serving woman and pushed her aside. "I shall tend my husband myself, Torhild. Go you out, find a tuft of grass and wipe the blood from the table." Olaf stood up and shook himself, as though he would be rid of both women. "Let be. I can bind this little thing myself," he said morosely. "And find me some other clothes than these rags." Eirik recovered rapidly. That day week he was already sitting up, eating with a good appetite of the dainties which his mother brought him. It looked as though he would escape from the stoat's bite with no worse harm than the loss of his right little finger. At first Olaf would not allow that the burn on his arm troubled him. He tried to work and use the arm as if nothing had happened. Then the wound began to gather, and he had to bind up his arm. After that he had fever, headache, and violent vomiting, and at last he had to take to his bed and let a man practised in leechcraft tend his arm. This lasted till near Advent, and Olaf was in the worst of humours. For the first time since they had lived together he was unfriendly to Ingunn. He constantly used a harsh tone toward her, and he would not have a word said as to how he had met with his hurt. The housefolk guessed, too, that he had very little joy of his wife being with child again. When Eirik was up and out of doors again, he talked of nothing but his misfortune. He was unspeakably proud of his maimed hand, and showed it off outside the church to all who cared to see, the first Sunday the people of Hestviken were at Mass. He boasted fearfully both of what his father had done, which seemed to him a mighty exploit, and of his own hardiness. If Eirik was to be believed, he had not let a sound out of him under the ordeal. "It is my belief that boy is a limb of the fiend himself, the way he lies," said Olav. "It will end badly with you, Eirik, if you do not give up this evil habit."